welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on the first of our Anatomy of a Crisis, Life Goes On, and now focusing on specific HR topics areas. So as you all guys all know, over the last year, I've got quite a lot of feedback. Has someone got a double? Yes. Okay. Over the last year, we've been talking to HRDs and HR thinkers and HR leaders every 2 weeks to get their input and their thoughts on how best and what changes are occurring, both because of the COVID crisis and the other changes in our business environment, so that we can pick up tips on what to learn from their experience and how to bring that to bear in our own companies. And today, I'm delighted to welcome Heather Brown, who is a very experienced HR director and has spent over 20 years working with various large financial service businesses, including UBS, HSBC, Aspen Insurance, etc., and is passionate about employee and business culture and empowering teams to do great work. Welcome, Heather. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And thank you very much for having me today to talk about performance management, which I know everyone loves.
Yes, and performance management is a fascinating question in the new environment we find ourselves in. What defines performance, I think, is increasingly changing, etc. So I wanted to ask you a few questions about that, Heather, to kind of get us kicked off, to actually focus down on the future of performance management and what we should be thinking about. So I suppose the first question to in my mind is really, you know, why should we be thinking about performance management? Isn't it a bit old hat, and is it really as relevant as it has been when we were all live? I mean, people get a bit tired of performance management. So tell us, why should performance management be right up there in this environment, and where should it fit in the hierarchy of thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, performance management is an interesting one because I think, for the most part, people hate performance management, right? Or historically have. I mean, I've never once been high-fived by a management team because it's time to focus on year-end performance management. I mean, including me, by the way, and my team, which is a shame because for me, performance management, it's meant to help us improve, right? That's what it's there for. It should enable and inspire us to do our best work through stretch goals, through great coaching and feedback. And there's a guy by the name of Daniel Pink, and he's written a book, and what really motivates people is autonomy, right? Mastery of what they do, and some kind of purpose in life, right? And I really truly believe that performance management can feed into that. Again, if you've got a great system where you've got, again, I'm repeating myself now, stretch objectives, great coaching and feedback. So I do think it's very important, but I also think that performance management, as it is in many companies, sort of a traditional way of doing it, it's failing us, right? It's not really doing that. And I think we are absolutely in the right point where we can start looking at it and changing it so that we can move towards what it's really designed to do, to add, have a real business impact on companies.
That's very interesting. So the three categories you mentioned, of which I'd like to pick up on the autonomy and mastery of a topic. That's very interesting. These are very personal focused
Yeah.
aspects. They're not things which are directly related to business performance and the performance within the business environment. And it's very interesting that you mention that these are the things which really drive people's fire and energy.
Yeah, I mean that is so. Obviously, you've got extrinsic rewards and intrinsic rewards. I mean, this is what, according to his research and others' research, this is what motivates people to be more productive, right? And obviously, if you are happier in your job, if you are more productive, it leads to the idea that you will be more productive at work, and that will obviously increase your market impact, right? I mean, a
Yes.
good performance management system, it should be transparent. I mean, it does do a lot of things. Having said that, that's part of the problem of performance management, is that it does do too many things, right? Companies rely on it for so many things, and some of those outcomes can actually be contradictory
So
as well.
could you unpack that a little bit? Um,
Yeah,
I do performance management. I kind of see that I probably do quite, but what sort of things are we talking about? What is that list of things which people think performance management kind of does?
yeah. Well, for one thing, everyone hates it, so that's never a good starting point. But I think part of the reason why performance management isn't delivering a lot of value, I think there's a number of reasons. For one thing, it tries to do too much, right? Companies rely on performance management for everything from year-end compensation decisions, promotion, identifying high potential candidates for development. Um, I mean, they use it for so many different things. They rely on it for administrative reasons, so backing up if there's an employment claim against you. You know, there's so many things. You know, you can't be all things to all people. And I think if you, for example, use it for everything,
Mhm.
an example of how it might be contradictory is if you say that you're an innovative company, right?
Yeah.
But yet you use it for compensation decisions, it can lead to behavior where people don't want to actually be that innovative, because if they try something new, they may fail. And if they
Mm.
fail, then they might feel like they're getting punished, right? So it can actually inhibit innovation. Facebook is kind of interesting. There was something that I read about recently. Despite the fact that they are considered one of the best companies to work for, they've started to go down in their rankings. Apparently, they're still using the old Jack Welch rank and yank
Mm.
system. And there's been some feedback that because they sit down twice a year, that's when they make their promotion decisions. So if I've got something I'm trying to launch, I'm going to hurry it up to make sure it gets done before I sit down with my manager. So
Mm.
that's very short-term thinking rather than long-term thinking, right? And then I may have to wait a whole year, right,
Mm.
for my promotion. So I might try to rush the products out. So you need to, so I think you need to think about that with your performance management. I think it's much better to use different metrics for different outcomes. The other thing about performance management, why I think it's failing, is because it's a lot of companies it's very process driven, right? When I think about my teams, when we've had performance management, I mean, half the time is just chasing managers to finish it, chasing employees, looking at the bell curve. It's all very administrative. It's very, very process driven. I read somewhere that Deloitte did a study and they spent 2 million hours a year on performance management. What's the cost benefit analysis of that? So it's super process driven. People see it as HR rather than something that's going to help them. The other thing is that I think with performance management, it can actually demotivate people, because sometimes both managers and employees don't necessarily have the tools and skills. I mean, I think most HR people on this call will relate to some managers that they don't want to give negative feedback, right? So so therefore employees don't necessarily improve, and then they get disappointed when they get their year-end review, etc. So I think a lot of those reasons, it's not doing what we want it to do. Everyone's focused on just getting the process done,
Mm.
and there's not necessarily those quality conversations, continuous feedback, etc. So I definitely think now is the time to review it. We're in a position now where senior leaders and boardrooms are actually talking about well-being and having employees be more productive. There's a real focus on it. We're now working in a much more agile way, and I think it's time to really flip performance management from moving it from an administrative function to something that actually adds value.
That's very yes, and that sounds great. So the problem is great. I was thinking about Jack Welch actually when you mentioned him there, and I
Yeah.
might it'd be great to look at the look a bit of the history of this, but he was kind of the inventor of performance management, I think. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on how that story was developed before then, we move on to what we should be thinking about and doing to make it better now. But before we do that, I'm kind of quite a bookish person, as you can see the books behind me, etc. And through the COVID crisis, I've been putting a little bookstall out the front of my house, which, free for anyone who wants to take the books which I finished with. The only book which has not been taken, or the only books which have not been taken by anyone, despite multiple times putting them out, are the Jack Welch books. So,
Yeah.
so there's
My,
obviously he's not, but he invented performance management, right? Heather, can you tell us a bit about that history?
I mean, performance management has been around for around the 1950s, actually, but he completely reinvented it.
Yeah.
So he changed what he did, and I guess it was called the GE model, but it was really the Jack Welch model. He really believed that there is a top of the class and a bottom of the class, right? So you've got a group of people, you're going to have the number one performer, and you're going to have the number, whatever the how many people you have. So he believed that in a ranking system and it was referred to literally as rank and yank. So you identified the top 20%, and then you identified the bottom 10%, and then you had everybody else in the middle. And he also advocated getting rid of the bottom 10%. So this, he felt, was the best thing to do for your company. Get rid of the bottom 10% underperformers so you could bring better performers in. And companies are still using that system. They don't call it rank and yank, and I'm not sure that they're getting rid of the bottom 10% all the time, but that's where it really came from. So, but the interesting thing about this is that there have been studies that show that if you actually rank individuals like that, right, it can actually lead to a cutthroat environment. And I've been around for a while, so I remember the whole rank and yank days. It can actually lead to a cutthroat environment because I'm going to make sure that I'm in that top 20%, right? Or certainly not in the bottom 10%. So it makes people very competitive in the company. Now, obviously, there's a view that some competition is very good, but you need to be really careful because I'm not sure that companies that are really cutthroat are going to necessarily be the help you win in the marketplace. The other thing is that talent doesn't happen on a bell curve, right? So it doesn't just always fit perfectly in this top 10%, bottom 10%, etc.
But it's very interesting what you're describing, because at the same time as he was talking about that differentiation of top performers to the bottom performers and a removal of the bottom performers, there was a lot of talk about companies being leaner, meaner, more focused, more. So in other words, the strategy was to create cutthroat organizations with a mono focus on one set of outcomes, with a view that that was the way to win in this kind of environment. I think it kind of relates a bit to, at that time, there being a view that everything could expand to any point. So, the environmental limitations, stuff like that, were far less well understood. So if you were better and leaner at doing a single thing, you would create a company of X size, any size, just by doing that more and more and more. And I think our world has changed since then. I don't think companies are aiming for that single mono set of performance, I think, Heather.
I think that's right. And of course, I think we have to remember that the whole rank and yank thing was in the 80s, right? And then we had a financial crisis, and companies were, especially in the financial services, they were doing multiple redundancies. And that was a system that they relied on. But it doesn't create a great culture. Now, of course, obviously, the baby boomers are very different in terms of what they expect in the workplace than younger generations, right? Mm-hmm. So, they're much more focused on having a purpose and their own career, right? They weren't willing to just do anything, for their career. It's just a very different environment. And obviously, to your point, there's been a lot of research about what is going to help companies move ahead. So before, it was always focused on the customer experience. But now there's much more focus on the employee experience, right? So, and after the pandemic, obviously, There's a lot more focus on employee well-being and engagement and having a more well-rounded holistic view in order to help them win in the marketplace, because customers are changing, employees are changing in terms of what their demands are. But what's interesting to me is I read very recently that 60% of the Fortune 500 companies are still using a ranking system.
Yes. Well,
And
my
that's a big
impression, and I think you touched on it earlier, is that what seems to have happened in a lot of performance cultures is that we've retained some of the old concepts and then added new concepts on the top. So in a typical performance conversation or setup, because we obviously design and work with companies to arrange, for example, their performance mechanisms, there is the legacy of still doing ranking, still doing that 10, 20%. But on top of that, there are questions about driving innovation. And on top of that, there are questions about driving feedback from people about their employees about their own experience. And on top of that, there are, and so what it seems to me is that everything's being built on top of each other. And you referred to that earlier, that there are
Yeah.
so many multiple desires of outcomes from a single mechanism, and nothing's been cut away. It's just being added on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think as the invitation talks about, is it time to review performance management? I mean, spoiler alert, from my perspective, absolutely. And I think we need to step back at the very beginning. And I do think we're at a great opportunity to do that, because companies are working in a more agile way, and everyone wants things to be more simple. I mean, for me, in my experience, performance management is not a simple process. There's so many steps to it, but I think we need to step back. I think we really need to be clear on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with performance management.
Mm-hmm.
What do we really expect from it? So, I mean, you can go to anybody and ask them why you do performance management, and they can list off 100 things that we do for it, right? Because it's part of our rota. It's something we do all the time automatically in terms of, thinking about it. So I think we need to sort of step back. What do we actually want to achieve with performance management? And I think that's something that needs to be done with the leaders of the organization. I think you have to really peel back the onion. So, what are your business issues? Of
Mm-hmm.
those, what are the most important? What has been your biggest challenge? And I think eventually you can start to get to the talent, your employee base. Sometimes you'll hear managers say, well, we don't have the skills, but of course we don't have enough learning. Okay, so maybe you want your performance management to focus on a growth type culture or a learning, I don't know, I'm just using that as an example, but really peel back the layers and look for the themes. I think it's important to think about the unintended consequences. So, for example, if you are very much an organization that wants innovation, don't have a final rating where your bonus is tied to it. Separate them out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some companies do that very differently. But think about that. I also think that people need to think that one size does not fit all. There isn't a solution for every employee in every group. Companies are very, very different. So I think we have to be very open-minded about that. But I definitely think the first thing we have to do is figure out, what do you want to do it for you, and decouple it from some of the other things you're trying to achieve. I think be a little bit more focused. I mean, a lot of companies have gotten rid of the final rating.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
might evaluate stretch objectives, etc. ING is a company that, in my opinion, have done some really interesting things with performance management. But I think that's the very first thing we have to do.
So tell us about what ING have been doing and how that works out.
Well, they actually, yeah, I mean, some companies have figured out performance management, years ago, right? It's not new for them.
Mm.
And in terms of ING now, I haven't spoken to somebody there since before the pandemic, but they have a program which is they refer to as Step Up, and they really have 5 elements to it. So for one thing, they very much trust their managers, and they did a tremendous amount of training for not just managers but also employees. Everyone at ING needs to have stretch objectives.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting about those stretch objectives is that their philosophy is that it's better to overpromise and under deliver than the other way around.
Mhm.
And when they do their evaluation, they may have this wonderful idea of what they want to do, but they may not get there. They may only get here, but getting here might still be good. The question when you're looking at whether or not they've been successful is, what did they learn while doing it, right? Were they intelligent about it? Did they get mentors, etc.? And in terms of what they have learned, even though they went to here, is it going to help them and other people in the organization, go over here maybe next year? So it might still be good that they only got here. So they're much more open-minded about how they evaluate. But in their experience, they've had more success with over-promising and under-delivering, as long as what they did was still good. So I think that's really an interesting concept. I really like that. They also have objectives that are agreed between the manager and the employee, but they do actually review them with peers and with other managers to validate them.
Mhm.
So there's also a lot of transparency. And I think that's really, really interesting. I think it's really good to have peers be aware of what everyone's objectives are, right? I mean, maybe some of them are private, but I'm just conceptually thinking about it. They've gotten rid of their single evaluation. There is no one overall evaluation. I know that in their stretch objectives, they evaluate them. They don't have a meet expectations, which I quite like, because a lot of people, it's an easy answer, just meet expectations. I don't want to have that difficult conversation. So they have, or at least they did have, unless they've changed it recently. You have excellent, well done, or needs improvement.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you have to choose.
Yeah.
So I quite like the idea of getting rid of an overall evaluation. They also only use it for part of their compensation decisions, not the whole thing. But they do have a lot of mechanisms for having continuous feedback. So I think that they've got a really interesting model.
Mhm.
So that's a company, and lots of companies do it very differently. I know some companies, they have a system in place where the manager and the employee will just quickly rank their objectives. And if they have to do it 4 times a year, it's very quick. It doesn't take very long to do for an employee. Now, if you and I if you rate me the same as I rate myself, great. That means we're talking. Let's move on. But if you rate me a 5 and I rate me a 1, using an example, you and I have to have a conversation.
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong here. So lots of companies do it very differently, but I really like the idea of having the stretch objectives
I
and
mean,
not
I've
having.
yeah. The more I think about it, the more I think objectives are a problem area. I can't remember the amount of times where I've been asked what my objectives are for the year, and you know what? Most of the time, it was a big lie. My
Oh
objective,
yeah,
I was picking objectives which I believed that they wanted to hear, firstly. Secondly, that sounded like kind of quite businessy and all that stuff, like the kind of company objectives. And thirdly, were things I could achieve relatively easily, or at least could achieve. They weren't my objectives. Yeah, if you really talk to people, a lot of objectives are secret objectives. So you might speak to somebody and say, what are your objectives? The real objectives could be, well, I'd like to just do an okay job. I'm actually looking after a year of this to move on to a different job in a completely different area, and I can't wait to do that. And I'm actually talking, whatever it is. But these people's personal objectives. Most people's personal objectives are slightly shameful and very different from the ones which they would reveal in that conversation. And indeed, and so you're starting that objective conversation almost from a lie, which is these are not the objectives. And I can't tell you that it's not true on the other side too. It is. So in setting objectives, quite frequently managers and other people are setting objectives which they know that person cannot meet or are irrelevant to the business. But again, this acceptability question of objectives comes into this area.
yeah, and of course, objectives is where performance management starts, isn't it? And I think we absolutely have to review how we do objectives.
Yeah.
And I agree with everything you've said. Oftentimes, objectives come from the top and they filter down, right? So we all want to write something that sounds great. A lot of people, I've spoken to people that spend hours making sure that they're smart, right? And they spend a tremendous amount of time on objectives, and they often sound very lofty, although not overpromising, because if they don't deliver, they don't want to get penalized, right?
Yeah.
They spend hours, and then the next time they look at those objectives is maybe at a mid-year, but maybe only once a year at the end of the year. They're not really meaningful. And I think that, as with everything right now, I think that performance management is like any other program, HR or otherwise, where you need to keep it simple, and it's got to become more agile. And I think we need to think about other models out there. There is a model that I read about recently, and it's called the OKR model. And it was actually established by, I think his name is John Doerr. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. Anyways, he's a venture capitalist. And essentially what that is, and it's objective by key results. So I will do something as measured by this set of key results. They're meant to be simple, right? They're meant to be practical. So this is what rather than looking at the CEO, this is what I'm actually doing, right? So rather than having it derived from the CEO, this is what I'm actually doing. They can range from simple and operational to stretch objectives. His idea is that they're transparent to others, so that my team members, everybody knows what I'm doing. So that sort of helps communication and aligning everybody. And they're designed to be updated. I mean, there's some companies that actually do this on a team level. So they will have a cross-functional team where they will have the same objectives. Whereas other companies think, well, that doesn't make sense to do it by team, because, this is my part, that's your part. But there's a number of ways to skin that cat, so to speak. But they're meant to be updated and reviewed all the time. Does this make sense? Are we still doing that? Let's change this objective. Obviously, they need to be aligned with the company goals, right? But they're really meant to be more in the real life. But I think a simpler model makes more sense.
Yes, so I think that's very interesting. So you've already taught us.
I'm sorry?
So you've already taught us that we need to look again with our leadership as to the purpose of performance management. Then you've talked about how we need to set objectives in a different way, either more pertinently to the people, and think about that area. I'm very interested in another change which has occurred during the last 9 months, and that seems to me that the speed of objectives and the speed of changing requirements in our jobs is kind of unprecedented. And I wonder whether there is a response in this area. So, for example, the first weeks of the COVID crisis, many people's objective was to get an office at home, get Wi-Fi, get set up, and work out how they're going to find space to work and the capability to work. So that's 2 weeks. Then the next 2 weeks was supporting other people in doing the same. And the next 2 weeks after that was, we've got a crisis in this area, in a particular area where, say, the middle office are unable to bring their IT home, etc. So we got this position where critical business objectives for the maintenance of our businesses at all have been changing week by week, day by day almost, for a very long period, and that's going to continue. I wonder how this is reflected and should be reflected in the performance management cycle, and what your thoughts are on that, Heather.
Yeah, I absolutely do think performance management needs to reflect the real world, right, as we are transforming. And the idea that you should have, objective setting in January, a quick catch up on June for a mid-year, and then December as your big conversation is just not impactful and doesn't really suit anybody. I don't think. I mean, you wouldn't expect the coach of a football team to do that, right?
Right.
I mean, it would be, they're evaluated, I assume every day, but certainly after every game, I would think, right? One of the, years and years ago, I remember we had the head coach and the receiver and quarterback of an American football team come and talk to our MDs. And at the time, these were the gods, right? They were just considered the best team ever. And they always said, look, after every game, even if we won, they went back to the locker room. They didn't celebrate. They went through the game and did a play-by-play. And they talked together as a team as to what they could have done better. Even though they won, but there are things, so that's sort of that continuous improvement. What I relate to is continuous feedback. So I think we have to really get rid of some of the administrative aspects of performance management. It's so process driven that it doesn't allow for what you're talking about. The idea that, in January, February, March, April, everyone was thinking about working from home. Well, that's not what you were doing in December. You were moving on to other things, right? So I think we need to think about continuous feedback. Now, this is a subject that we have been talking about since I remember, right? But there hasn't really been any accountability. And managers are said, hey, sit down make sure you're sitting down with your employees all the time and giving them informal feedback. The year end should never be a surprise. But I don't actually think the needle has changed, right? A lot of managers and employees don't have the skill set. So I think we really need to revitalize what we mean by continuous feedback and actually make it happen. I think there are companies that do this really well, right? Employ a systematic approach to doing it, right? They include, there are some systems and technology out there, which, rapid feedback technology, which is super easy to use and is often positive and developmental. They've implemented that kind of thing. They have written evaluations, they have team meetings. Pixar, for example, every time they're doing a movie, they sit down throughout the whole process, and you could have killed yourself coming up with this great idea. This is what we're going to do next. They sit down in a room and they literally tear it apart, but they come with solutions together. So when you're accustomed to an environment where you're giving each other feedback, it doesn't feel so bad when somebody says, you know what, you speak really quickly,
Yes.
and I didn't understand, or whatever it is. Now, that Pixar model isn't going to work for everybody, right? I can't imagine sitting down with a bunch of traders and say, here's what I saw you did wrong today. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? But there are ways, you need to be creative and innovative. And I think, with working, do a pilot somewhere, right?
Heather, I'm going to ask you what your 3 tips are in a short while, but we have a flood of questions which I want to put to you. The first of them is really, we tend to separate out performance management with dealing with individual poor performers. Is that right? Is that the right way to be doing that? Or should we be amalgamating the two? So is performance management the way to identify and deal with poor performers, or should it be a separate thing entirely?
In my opinion, I think it should be separated. Because I think, from my perspective, performance management really should be inspiring employees. It should be, I love the ING model, over promise, under deliver, from a stretch objective perspective, right? I think using it for poor performers is the wrong focus, because that's the negative, right, versus the positive. Performance management with poor employees is absolutely a critical area for HR and management to work on, because that can have a huge impact on your reputation as an organization, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think it needs to be decoupled. Now, clearly, I've been advocating that we should use different metrics for different outcomes, right?
Yes.
There has to be some kind of calibration, because if I'm nominated as, a key star, and she needs to have some fantastic development, but yet I'm failing, right? I mean, you need to look into why that would be. But I really think we need to take performance management, try to eliminate the administrative nature of it, and move to something more positive. I think we need to think about it differently. And I think if you can embed a continuous feedback, that can help with that aspect as well. But I think that's a very big subject.
We have a comment, which is that actually there is a pre-Jack Welch route of performance management, rooted in the military, who originally invented it. And then the comment that was Jack Welch probably wasn't very democratic. So as we move businesses to be more and more democratic, then actually this performance management question becomes more and more an anathema. It's more distant from the way we run businesses, etc. So Agile 360 are kind of the next set of thoughts. But I am going to ask you in a second, what do you think the real future is? I want to be pushing you forward, Heather, into not past and the history, but where you think performance management might be in 3 to 5 years' time. Are we going to have it at all? So that would be very good. And then finally, I'm going to ask you then for your key recommendations and takeaways. So if I put myself forward in my, to be honest, if I was going to put myself forward into a future point in time, I wouldn't go just 5 years. I'd go a few more than that. But let's go just a few years forward. What are you thinking we're going to see?
I hope over time, performance management as something that companies do isn't really called performance management anymore. I mean, I think that the comment, I think, kind of nails it. I mean, we all know some managers do this brilliantly and they don't have any system, right? They're constantly having conversations and are able to be very inspiring and fantastic coaches for their employees. I mean, at the end of the day, that's managers should be inspiring employees to be successful on their own, right? Asking the right questions. So it's, and because I believe that we need to get rid of some of this administration, making sure you filled your form out by such and such a date, etc. So I do hope over time we establish our cultures. I mean, performance management should be creating a culture, right, where everyone seeks to improve. And if you're able to implement coaching and feedback and having making sure it's continuous, then I think over time the concept of performance management you don't need anymore
So
because you're just
performance,
doing it as
so
yeah.
performance management as a cultural driver rather than a performance driver. I think that's very interesting. So driving the culture of the business and monitoring that as opposed to looking at individual performance, etc.
I mean, obviously, I mean, you do need managers to be working with employees to help them get to where they want to go. That obviously also meets the needs of the company, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
going to need to have systems in place to identify your high potentials. Obviously, is performance management the right place to do that? There may be some other metrics that may work better for you. I mean, there is no one size that fits all. I don't believe one size fits all. I think that different mechanisms work in different organizations. And I do think um, that over time, if we can make it as easy as possible, make it in the workflow, right? There are systems out there that I've read about where after a meeting, people just quickly go online and list what their feedback is. And there are some systems, so I've read about where it can generate what they're hearing. So instead of getting individual comments, it can look for trends. Say, oh, out of these 300 comments, you speak too quickly or you weren't prepared or whatever it is. So I think if it can become more in the workflow your every day, I think that would be amazing. But of course, both managers and employees have to be trained. And I think that that's a mindset change. That's a culture. That's going to happen over a day, in one day. But you can start to implement, try things, do pilots, start small and grow it while you're obviously getting feedback and improving it. So hopefully, I'm not sure that answers exactly the question, but that was my response.
No, that's very good. And I think that you touched on another point, which is how technology, I suspect, is going to bring significant change over the next few years, and already is. I
Oh,
think
at
that
pace.
part of the mechanisms, the approaches which we saw to performance management back in the 80s and stuff like that, and before, were were driven by the fact that the tools and the ability to do that stuff was still a very manual exercise. It was impossible to do things like accurate 360 feedback. It was impossible to set dynamic goals for individuals. It was very hard to bring together managers under a single view of culture and growth of the business. Just bringing together the performance management team and printing out all the documents. I mean, right, I remember, you must do too, Heather. That was a major incident. If you didn't get your all your comments in at least kind of a month before, then you couldn't be sure it'd be printing out for your promotees, and they'd all be there on the boardroom table or whatever it was you were using. I mean, whereas all of that's kind of gone away now, or much of that's gone away. And I think that is that opportunity which technology is bringing to look at things in a different way, I think is both exciting and also somewhat sinister, but that's a different element to it. That actually, we're hearing a lot in the COVID crisis of the more presentee type organizations using technology monitoring tools and stuff like that to actually manage maintain performance conversations. But Heather, with that, we're coming to the end of our allotted time. So could you tell us what are the 3 top tips for what we should be thinking about and doing over the next kind of weeks and months in the performance management area?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I think the very first thing that I would suggest people focus on is really being clear on what it is you and your organization want to get out of performance management, and thinking about decoupling it from everything, right? Is really nailing it down. I think that's really the first thing. I think the other thing is I think we need to find a way to eliminate all the administration. And I think if organizations are, it can be a big change, but start small, right? Work in an agile way. Find some areas of the organization where you can brainstorm and pilot some ideas, so you can come up with some interesting, innovative ideas. I mean, I think HR can and should be an area of innovation, right? And obviously you need to communicate. This can't be done just in HR. You've got to involve other people, obviously, and start doing pilots. If you're looking to implement continuous feedback in your organizations, think about doing it small, right? But you got to make sure your managers and employees are trained, but maybe do quarterly sessions where employees lead it, involving other people. So I think understand what it is you want, what for your company makes sense, what you want to focus on, making sure it's agile, doing pilots. You can't change the whole thing right away, but start with pilots and understand what does and what doesn't work in your organization, involving others, obviously. And I think those are 2 really important things I think that you need to do. And there was another one. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you can start to do more, implement continuous feedback in a way where people are accountable, because we've been talking about this for years, but find ways to actually make it accountable, and training managers and employees to be more, coaching, that just empowers people. So I think those are probably the 2 things.
I really
and definitely change your objective setting, in my opinion. Make sure it's practical and in the real world. And I think it should be something you need to think about, how you make those objectives transparent to the team and others, and getting validation from outside between just the manager and the individual. It helps communication. It helps understanding who's doing what. I think that those are a couple of things that you can do right away.
Very interesting and real food for thought there. I do think that on the innovation side, the idea of starting small and innovating, one of the lessons of the last 9 to 10, or even now approaching 12 months, is that businesses are more open to innovation and more open to mistakes and errors than we've ever seen before. It is a cultural attribute of HR people to test, make sure everything's perfect before launching anything out to anyone in the business. It's clear why that's the case. Risk averseness, the need to be risk averse, the need to drive consistency across our business. But I think we have an opportunity, and a growing opportunity, which has come out of this crisis, where the business is more forgiving of our ability to innovate and try new ideas. And if they are not good, it doesn't matter in the way it used to. And I am, and in this area and all other areas, my final message today would be really that I would encourage people to take advantage of that. This is a permanent change of the COVID crisis. This is something which I don't know about you, Heather, but I've never seen in my career before. And it's an opportunity which is extraordinary, which is this opportunity to actually go out and try things in a way in which they don't need to be perfect anymore, because we are starting finally, after goodness knows how many hundreds of years of business, to work out that business is an imperfect art, and that we are influenced so much by activities and things outside of our control. I don't know, Heather, whether you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and I think just adding to what you said, I agree 120% with what you said. But I also think in terms of change, you know, change is happening much more quickly now. You can get more things done very, very quickly. What used to take a year or two to implement now can take a month or two, right? I mean,
Yes.
the pace of change is happening so quickly. And I think with performance management, where it is can't be a mindset change for people, I do believe this change can happen rapidly in a way that it couldn't before. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity to really for HR to really make a difference and help their organizations into the future. So, and I think performance management, you can really help drive that culture much more quickly than you used to before. So,
Heather, it's been delightful talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time, and for the audience, thank you so much for spending your time here. My view, and what we're intending to do this year, is do focus sessions on different sides of HR and look at those things. None of us are trying to provide all the answers, but I hope that everyone's taken away one or two new ideas or thoughts from the conversation today, which you'll be able to use in your businesses and work life, or just for your own performance conversation. So I hope it's been useful. It's been great to see you all. And Heather, I'd like to thank you very much for your time too.
oh well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everybody for taking time to listen to me. I mean, it's
Great.
such a huge topic; we could talk about it all day. So,
Well, that is true, and I think my take on it is that I read, for example, the FT every day of the week, and I find that I only have one or two things which I pick up from it in the week, but those one or two things stick with me forever.
yeah.
It's kind of worth the investment. So thank you all for investing your time in talking to us today, and we'll answer the remaining questions offline. And thank you very much. Have a great day and rest of the week.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye.